good evening, all, from whatever part of the world you're joining. It's absolutely a pleasure to have you join us for this very fascinating interaction that I'm expecting to have with a very dear friend of mine, Sean Randolph. Sean is somebody I've known for at least a decade, and I think we crossed paths for some odd thing at Asia Society one of the years, about a decade back. And then I think we've had a fascinating set of interactions trying to understanding India. Of course, we've had differences of opinions, which is bound to happen as academics, but I think it's just been a lovely set of interaction. But more about Sean. Sean is somebody who's the senior director at the Bay Area Economic Council Institute or Economic Institute. And then, of course, he's somebody who's done tremendous level of work on India. If you've not seen his work, especially on innovation systems or innovation in India in comparison to the Bay Area, his work on comparison of states and cities is absolutely fascinating. You should actually look at it. His profile runs into pages, but I think what matters here is that we listen to him and understand from him what he thinks about India. And he's going to share his views or ideas on Indian innovation and its ties to the Silicon Valley. So Sean, I'll push the floor towards you, or give the floor to you, and start with your presentation, and then I'm going to get into an interaction with you. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks very much, Amit. It's delightful to be with you. Especially, it feels like we're both at Stanford, but I'm north of the Golden Gate Bridge, and I guess you're in Delhi, but I think we're all united through Stanford today. I'd just share a few thoughts about really a sort of a Silicon Valley perspective on what's going on in India around technology innovation, how Silicon Valley plays into that, and really the significance of India now and perhaps looking forward on the technology front. And again, the technology front enabled by the growing innovation capacity in India. So I'll walk through a little bit of this. I think there we go. What's been going on, if we trace it back 10 years or more, is that our ties with India, the US ties broadly, but especially Silicon Valley, are more and more defined, of course, by geopolitics and values, but I think technology is really at the heart of that relationship. So I think the acceleration of the relationship we've seen in recent years has happened as new markets in India have been created, reduced barriers to investment coming into India have been very instrumental in that. I think if we look at the geopolitics that both the US and India find themselves in, that's also become increasingly an enabler, which I'll get to in just a moment. But we have this growing geostrategic alignment. You know, it's not an alliance, it's an alignment. But there's a lot of moving parts in that have a technology component. There's the US Indo-Pacific strategy, where India is sort of connected into the US and the Asia Pacific. It's not all about China, but certainly China is something we all see out of the corner of our eyes. There's the Quad relationship that has a technological component too. The US-India Climate and Energy Agenda partnership also out there. And maybe most important, ISET, the US-India Initiative on Emerging and Critical Technologies, which covers a broad range of technologies, and again, is part of this growing geostrategic relationship between the United States and India. So we look at India's significance for technology companies, and here I'm really focusing on Silicon Valley. This has been the case for many years. It's not new, but if anything, it has strengthened in the last few years. So if we look at companies like Cisco that went into India very, very early, John Chambers, when he was there, established the presence there in Bangalore as this company's second global headquarters. If we look at kind of the market in India, Google, almost 100% of mobile searches on Google, and $10 billion commitment to investing in India over a period of years as it expands its market there. We have Meta as well, largest market for WhatsApp, Twitter, third largest market in the world, Salesforce, the second largest employment center for Salesforce after here in the US. LinkedIn, 90 million users, again, largest market after the US. Apple, very significant change the last couple of years as it's now producing its flagship iPhones in India. It used to produce rather older or lower grade phones in India. Now it's actually significantly expanding its production of its flagship new models. And then Intel, 14,000 employees around design and engineering, including its latest and largest design and engineering center outside the United States. So you can see this enormous investment by Silicon Valley companies and Bay Area companies in India, connected at one level to just the scale of their presence in the market, but behind that, very often significant R&D happening within India. If we look at foreign direct investment as one measure of what's going on, we've seen a growing scale of FDI coming into India. And it's really grown quite dramatically in the last 5 years, $60 billion. Back in 16-17, up to more than $83 billion in 21-22. I think from a technology standpoint, innovation standpoint, it's significant that the leading sector for this investment is hardware and software, about 25%. Other things going in there, but the US is the largest investor in India. But here we can see how the hardware and software sector is really very much in the lead in terms of where the FDI from the US into India is going. If we look at the Bay Area here, and again, we're enormous investors in India, you can see the dollar value, but also the number of deals that have been going in India, and they've been sustained at a very strong and sustained at a very high level. And I think this goes back to what we were saying just a few moments ago. So what are the companies from here investing in? Well, they're investing in technology. Overwhelmingly, this is going into the ICT and electronics sectors, both in terms of a percentage of FDI and a total value of FDI. You know, there's investment going into other fields, but it's very, very much a technology and electronics and ICT story. This shows the states where the investment is going. And Karnataka, clearly the number one. Bangalore has been a major base for companies from Silicon Valley for a long time. And that is still the case. But if we look at really the top five, it's Karnataka, Maharashtra, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, and Haryana, especially Gurgaon. I think what is interesting about this is if we look at Indian states, and you'll be so familiar with this, Ahmed, we follow very closely what's in the India Innovation Index, looking at the competitiveness of Indian states. And, we're really interested where we are here at the Bay Area Council in a state perspective, because we're a sub-regional organization. We look in particular at the economy of Silicon Valley and the greater Bay Area, but that's very much part of the economy of California. So it's very interesting to us, especially as companies from here invest all around the world, that they're investing in countries, of course, but they're also investing in states. And so there's a level of the sort of detail when you're looking at investing overseas. There's, of course, the national policy environment. There's also the state level policy environment and the infrastructure and other things. And significantly, the top 5 states here in the Innovation Competitiveness Index are, guess what? Connecticut, Telangana, Haryana, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. And so these are all states that in some varying combinations of initiatives and policies are investing in their innovation capacity. It may be computer programs in schools or getting women into technology. There's a range of different ways to go at it. But I think the bottom line here is that the states in India that are succeeding in attracting this really high level of investment from Silicon Valley are in fact the ones in the innovation index that have been in the lead with supportive policies. And so there we have the same thing again, pretty much a mirror image of what's in the innovation index, with where the investment overwhelmingly in software and ICT from Silicon Valley is going to. So if we go to the background of this, what's sort of enabling this sort of deeper level of innovation that we're seeing now? And of course, a lot of that goes back to actually what you were talking about in a previous dialogue program, which are India's national policies to advance digitalization, which is happening across a wide range of fronts, very systematic. And so this is covering mobile, cloud, big data analytics, digital services. These things are being driven by what's become ubiquitous broadband, enabled by very low cost phones and a high rate now of digital literacy. So India has almost, these numbers probably change month to month, but probably 800 plus million internet users, rising constantly. And then if we look at the infrastructure of that, I think the Aadhaar systems, the unified payments interface. So you've got the digital identity foundation. Digital payments have been extended to really every corner of the country, rural areas, people of all incomes. You've got the Bharat Digital Mission, universal health interface, increasing access to healthcare, lower cost for healthcare. So this is not only kind of extending these kind of services and accesses to larger and larger numbers of Indians, making it near universal, but the fact that we have now in India these national platforms that are available for startups in a wide range of fields to build on. So it's not telling them what to do or how to do it, but simply the availability, if they are in the digital field, really is a critical sort of catalyst for the ability of emerging companies to catalyze, rather to innovate in the digital space. So if we look up at startup investment, what happened in the few years, kind of keeping here on the theme of startups in India, it hasn't always been a hot market for Silicon Valley. In the early 2000s, quite a few came in. Afterward, a pretty good number dropped out. They just weren't seeing the return on investment that they had hoped for. The firms that remain largely, set themselves up as more local India arrangements. But there was a pause or a slight withdrawal of interest from Silicon Valley into India. I think a lot of that changed a few years ago with Walmart's acquisition of Flipkart, where it was clear, like, oh, you actually can make money in India. And they started to filter back in, and then became very active. So this really, the peak, of course, was as global venture was peaking really during the pandemic. But the last figures we've seen, they may be a little bit out of date now, that there are more than 50,000 active startups across India, high level of valuation. This year, of course, it's different, but there has been a rising level, approaching $40 billion of venture investment in Indian startups. And then if you go back to the day of Flipkart, there were no unicorns. I think a year or so ago, but there were about 44 new ones. India has the the largest number of startups that are considered unicorns in the world after the US and after China. So I think India is having moved up the scale in its ability to produce these technology-based, fast-growing, younger companies really is a remarkable shift in only a short period of years. And again, I think a lot of this is driven and enabled by the digital infrastructure that India has developed now, cheap, ubiquitous data, growing depth within the startup system, and then for the venture investors, the fact that they can actually see successful exits, which is an incentive to continue to invest. And so a lot of that relates to the market. More than 1 billion consumers who need, efficient healthcare, loans, insurance, digital solutions to, a variety of issues, and about 100 million small businesses that need the same thing. There is a factor, I think, for our venture firms in that China has become a more problematic place to invest. Not that they're leaving China, but it's certainly more difficult than it was. And by comparison, now India is looking very, very interesting and much easier to invest in some respects. And at the same time, we're seeing Indian startups that, of course, are focused on the massive India market, starting to look more at global markets as well across a range of sectors. This year has been a pretty tough year in India, as it has in Silicon Valley and absolutely everywhere in the venture and startup world. Valuations dropping, startups tightening their belt, less venture capital going in the system. But I think the underlying capacity for innovation that we saw in the last several years suggests that if we look slightly to the longer term, it's going to be increasingly robust. So these are the major investors in Indian startups, and you can see the number one, Sequoia Capital from Silicon Valley, Axel, Y Combinator, relatively smaller amounts of investment, but a lot of them. So there's a very significant footprint now by our Silicon Valley venture firms in the Indian startup market. Lots of sectors. And again, this is where we're seeing innovation in fintech, health tech, renewable energy, EV, semiconductors, space are all areas of opportunity, among others, of course. And this kind of brings me back to where we started this conversation, which is the strategic context that the relationship between the United States and India is providing, which it's not all about that context, but certainly the closer strategic relationship between the two countries has an important technology component that I think will help to drive these things and I think really deepen the level of cooperation in the coming years. And probably the best window for looking at that is the Modi-Biden summit last June. And if you read the summit joint statement, it's all about technology. Probably 80% of what they're talking about in there is about technology. So ISET is right at the center of that, covers a lot of different technologies. They announced an expanded cooperation around space, including human space flight, cooperation on satellites. They launched a semiconductor supply chain and innovation partnership. Of course, everybody's now focusing on global supply chains. Different countries are looking for increased activity domestically. There are various incentive programs, and so India and the US are now looking to coordinate their semiconductor incentive programs. Two task forces on telecom were launched. There's a big global topic now, certainly from the US standpoint, but other countries too, around secure telecommunications networks. US and India launched an Indo-US quantum coordination mechanism. So here we're getting down into some deep science. They also confirmed a program that had been under discussion previously to jointly develop and commercialize AI, as well as quantum technology. So this is out there pretty much at the cutting edge. There's also collaboration, which was highlighted in the summit between the U.S. Department of Energy and India on a major facility, the largest international one on U.S. soil, the long baseline neutrino facility that India is investing in. And then I think something that will get a lot of attention as time goes on, the new U.S.-India New and Renewable Energy Technology Action Platform, or RETAP. So, you can see here just almost a full stack of technologies, from telecom to space to renewable energy to quantum to AI, where there's a growing collaboration between the United States and India that's building on the innovation and the innovative capacity in India, the engineering capacity in India. And I think these are things that have the potential to accelerate not only kind of the U.S.-India relationship, but also accelerate the development of these technologies within India. So just to finish, this part of the conversation, some of this is being driven in the background by what's happening globally, especially vis-a-vis China. So there are issues that the United States has with China, and India does as well. And I think that has led to sort of a consolidation of interest, going back to a few of the things I mentioned at the very beginning, such as the Quad, which is also a significant platform for technology collaboration. So we're seeing this reflected in global supply chains, especially for cutting edge technologies. And from a United States standpoint, what the U.S. is driving toward is a diversification of R&D and production in these key technologies to what are considered trusted and reliable partners, creating more resiliency in the supply chain and diversification away from over-reliance on any one partner. In this case, that over-reliance is perceived to be in China. That was driven in part, and still is driven in part, by perceptions of questions regarding Chinese long-term intentions, security issues with China, experienced during the pandemic when China had a hard shutdown and supply chains were severely disrupted for American companies in China. So I think the diversification away from China, again, not leaving China, but significant diversification, is pointing companies in their investment toward several other locations as prime alternatives. So Southeast Asia is one, Vietnam. So that's not a high-tech solution, but it's certainly one where some kinds of production is going. You have Mexico as another significant destination. There's lots of engineers in Mexico. It can be a high-tech solution. It tends to be more advanced manufacturing. There is a lot of capacity there around engineering. And again, you've got zero supply lines there. You drive a truck across the US-Mexico border. But as I talk to company location specialists and companies that are managing global supply chains, I hear more and more about India. And again, there we're talking about the market, but we're talking about also the innovation capacity, the engineering capacity. So I think India will be the beneficiary increasingly of supply chains as they shift globally. And for technology companies, I think India is perhaps the prime destination, or at least potentially the prime destination for where that investment goes. There are a lot of thematic areas behind this that I mentioned. I didn't really go into defense, but there's a lot going on around defense technologies, critical and emerging technologies. Semiconductors is a topic, cooperation around standards, climate and energy. We heard that referred to in the Biden-Modi summit, supply chains, AI, startups. So these are all thematic areas in the technology field that it appears are rapidly developing. That presents opportunities for a deeper research collaboration, deeper industrial collaboration, and in all this, bringing it back to Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is playing and will probably continue to play a a central role. We're seeing some of that in the investment, sort of large scale investment that's going in. A couple of years ago, Google announced its $10 billion India digitalization fund, investment of $4.5 billion into geo, Meta $5.7 billion into geo, applied materials, putting a lot of investment now into India around its semiconductor research and design activity. So semiconductors is a particular field for growth. We know the Indian government would like to get more manufacturing of semiconductors in. That's proving a little difficult. It'll probably happen. But short of that, there's at least 60,000 engineers in the field in India and one of the world's top design capacities. So again, I think this goes to the capacity within India. Even if India isn't making semiconductors at much of a scale now, that kind of the innovation, the design, the engineering capacity is very much there. So what we're seeing is that if we take it back 10, 15 years, India was kind of a global back office for a lot of these companies in Silicon Valley. And again, Silicon Valley are India's biggest customers in the corporate world. And it was really a back office, and now it's really moved. We've had R&D centers in India for many, many years, but the direction is toward being more of a technology co-creator to some degree through the presence of India IT companies in the valley, but really much more so because of the scale of the market, the innovation capacity, the engineering capacity, and the strategic imperatives we're seeing for deeper engagement within India itself. So those are my thoughts, Emmett. Happy to dig into any of this.
Thank you, Sean. This is very fascinating, and I have tons of questions actually that arise in my mind. So you pave a very fascinating picture about India in terms of thinking that everything's perfect out here, and India has moved from a back office place to something which is just a place to look at. The first question, do you see any challenges that are forthcoming, or what kind of challenges will arise?
Yeah, I wouldn't suggest it's perfect by any means. I think there's a lot of wrinkles in there. If we look at, for example, the startup field, Indian startups tend to be more on the kind of services, social media side. They tend to be not on hard tech. And if you compare Indian startups with Chinese startups tend to be more on the hard tech side. So I think it's not about a gap, but startups could probably be doing more in the hard tech side. I think semiconductors raises a different set of questions. As I mentioned, the government would very much like to get more of the semiconductor action globally, and maybe related in part to Make in India and in part to how global semiconductor supply chains are being realigned right now. It's been a goal to get fabs into India. And so far, our companies here, the Silicon Valley chip companies, aren't buying it. I mean, they're very supportive in principle, but what they're saying is, well, India at this moment doesn't really have the market. It helps to have a market, like they're producing in China, and there's a huge market for chips in China, despite all the issues and restrictions we have with China now. But they're saying India doesn't really have that much of a market for chips yet, and it doesn't have the ecosystem in place yet. So these would be the supply chain companies that kind of, and there's a lot of them that need to feed in the sector. The packaging and testing companies. So they're saying that it's not just a question of dropping in a fab, that's not going to work very well unless it's dropping into the right the right kind of ecosystem. So I think those are, there are systemic gaps and challenges that India still needs to fill to be able to kind of advance at a level that's commensurate with its underlying kind of engineering and innovation capacity.
When you really talk about, say, the innovation capacity within the country, or you talk about the talent availability, what is the kind of data that you're looking at, or what are the kind of numbers you're looking at? You're saying that, of course, we have 1.1 million engineers that pass out of Indian colleges each year. So there seems to be a large pool. But any challenges at that front that the companies or enterprises are even are talking about?
Well, I think there's always been a certain challenge around quality that, of course, you have a certain kind of people coming out of the IITs, but if you just look at the gross numbers of graduates in these programs coming out of Indian colleges and universities, they're not all instantly employable. The quality is variable. So I think you can find some of the best engineers in the world in India, but I think the volume of production kind of doesn't really speak to the variable quality. And then, there has been, which we find in Silicon Valley to a degree too, a lot of demand for engineers and basically, unstable workforces sometimes as they kind of shift and jump around, which is a cost for the companies as well. So I think there's an underlying challenge still with India's higher education system in generating in a sustained way both the numbers, but also the level of quality of engineers that this kind of growth we're looking at is going to require.
So I'm just trying to tie in your comment to what you said about semiconductors. One is, of course, you said it is very important that India actually has the appropriate market. India possibly is not a very developed market for the chips or for the semiconductors that are going to be manufactured, or India is looking at manufacturing. That is, of course, one. The second thing is the ecosystem. So I do see you say that there is a flaw in the ecosystem in terms of availability of labor or availability of quality labor. What else are those parameters that you would really want to look at when you talk about ecosystem in India? One of the parameters or aspects that I do hear when people talk about is quality of electricity. Like, can we really provide that or not? Or what are the other things that you would like to see that India develop further so that it actually becomes a place where manufacturing could actually happen, say, in a decade from now?
Well, that gets us, you mentioned manufacturing, Amit, that I didn't really talk about that, but of course there's the whole Make in India, and that connects into technology manufacturing. So again, where there have been some really positive developments, where we're seeing, Foxconn, Apple expanding its production pretty significantly in southern India. And it's not that they're leaving China, that, the scale of what they're doing in China is still massive and much greater than what they're doing in India. But if you look at the fact that they're now producing the top line products there, and the trend seems to be shifting in India's direction, that's positive. So, that's not necessarily innovation, that's manufacturing. But there's a connection, of course. So I think there are broad issues in India still that maybe ultimately they kind of come home in this technology and innovation space. But I think there is so much unevenness in education across the country, even at the level of basic education and quality of education, really from the elementary school level all the way up. So I think there's opportunity in sort of mass access to digitalization and the kind of information and services that can come through that. So perhaps there's an opportunity for India to kind of leverage now that kind of access to improve the quality of education. But I think it's much more uneven still that it needs to be, and that's really from primary right up through the college level.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And Sean, could I just request you to switch off the presentation?
That's a good idea. Thank you very much. Yeah. Much better.
Thank you. And so just moving ahead, like you make a very important point in the beginning of your presentation, and that was the growing geostrategic alignment. And of course, like you talked about the US Indo-Pacific strategy, the Quad, the climate partnership or the energy agenda, then of course the whole emerging and critical technology initiative. Is it only driven by what is happening in China, or is it that there is a far bigger idea at play? You do make a point that India is a democracy, etc., or there is a rule of law that actually operates. But what is the deeper thinking that is going behind in terms of how that whole alignment is going to really shape up in the future? What India needs to really do to maintain, because India has also taken stances which have not really gone down very well in the recent past, something like with the Ukraine Russia war or whatever. So how do you really look at this relationship over a period of time?
I think it will be increasingly important in the United States, and it's become increasingly important in the United States over the last 5 to 6 years or more. I think back to the days, say before the last Bush administration, when we didn't have the nuclear agreement, and there were all kinds of, I think, technology collaboration was more difficult. You found a more closed market from a regulatory standpoint, and I think there was a lot of frustration with India at that time. My organization, this is like mid 2000s, 2007 or 8. We did 2 large studies in 2 years, looking at the relationship and the potential of China for Silicon Valley, and the other was the relationship and the potential for India. From the China one, a lot happened. We opened 4 offices in China, took countless groups to China. It didn't happen the same way with India. It was much slower. I think the perception was that the business environment was more difficult, the regulatory environment more difficult, took longer to get things done, very complex, closed market in many ways. And then that all really did start to change in a significant way and an accelerating way. So I think from a U.S. standpoint, it's not just about China. I think India's always been there, but more as a frustration than something people could really invest in. And I think that's what's changing a lot now. So obviously, from an economic standpoint, the potential scale of the market, now the per capita income in India is still a lot lower than it is in China, but obviously an enormous market by any scale. And I think people are seeing the technological capacity within India, and just the fact that it is now far from perfect, but much easier to invest. The government will work with investors. You find states that are really opening the doors very, very widely. So it's always been a source of engineers. We import a lot in the US, a lot of Indian talent, a lot of R&D centers in India for many, many years. So I think that's just all becoming more sophisticated. And then I think the China factor drops into that pot, and that kind of makes it boil, because I think both India and the US are seeing, very real geostrategic challenges from China, also economic challenges of a competitive nature, but given the nature of China's government and the degree of alignment between government policy, Communist Party priorities and leadership with their national economic strategy, state capitalism, a whole variety of things. that I think we're both facing both economic and strategic challenges. And so that really, I don't want to say it's a no-brainer, but it really does bring those conversations together. And what I've seen is kind of a deepening conversations in the Quad as the number of topics have grown and grown to include a deeper conversation around technology. And again, going back to what Modi and President Biden have discussed, a growing focus on technology there. So I'd say it's not, China looms in the background of a lot of this. But I think if you took China out of the equation, there's still a really strong foundation to go forward together on many fronts. But it's obviously, these countries are not identical in their viewpoints. You mentioned Ukraine, the fact that the Indian government hasn't condemned the Russian invasion. It's kind of been a little bit more than wishy-washy on that one. Continuing to import Russian oil, continuing to import Russian arms, although that's declining relatively. I think that's being shifted more toward the U.S. and the West. So I think it's accepted, Amit, that there are going to be differences, but that the overarching strategic interests are much larger than the differences, and if possible, shouldn't be allowed to really impede the larger objectives. And so I think some of the trade issues with China have, or rather with India, have been kind of solved, taken off the table, and to some degree that may be because maybe those are relatively minor concerns and interests compared to the larger opportunity around technology and this wider sort of geostrategic, not alliance, but alignment.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And let's move ahead. You made a very important point on India's innovation ecosystem. You talked about states. I would like to go to a deeper question here. Of course, there are those 5 states where most of the investments are happening, and you did share the data: Karnataka, Maharashtra, Telangana, Tamil Nadu, and Haryana. And they effectively are the same set of states which are on top of the innovation index. So what I'm really coming to is, you see that there is this level of disparity that exists within the Indian ecosystem, or how states are growing, how various locations could be innovative. What is it that we should do? Because that actually does create sets of challenges in terms of how income levels are going to increase over a period of time, how GDP grows in these states over a period of time. How do you really look at this situation after all? Because we have seen that the dominance of growth in the states that we talked about is fairly high. And there are some states which are lagging behind there.
Boy, I'm not quite sure how to advise on that one. We have kind of a similar set of challenges in the US. If you look at where is technology-based growth concentrated, so where do you have these high incomes, where do you have the concentration of technology investment, which economies are more or less booming, it's a pretty limited number of places. It's Silicon Valley in the Bay Area, it's Seattle, it's Austin, something's happened in LA and San Diego, Charlotte, North Carolina, Boston, suburban Washington. But you can count them on, depending on how many fingers you think you have, 5 or 10 fingers. That leaves a lot of the country out of the picture. And so, we've seen that. You don't want to read too much into it. In some of the political disparities we've seen in the US over the years, where you have some division between growth centers that are technology based and very wealthy, and a lot of other places that just haven't benefited. And so the federal government has been trying here to create technology hubs. I think they just announced as part of, coming through some of the big legislative packages in the last year or two, including the infrastructure package that was agreed upon, to create like 17 innovation hubs across the country. And each one of those being essentially a consortium of different kinds of parties and interests and companies and universities, but with federal government support stimulating that that tried to kind of jumpstart innovation and technology development in parts of the U.S. that have not had the benefit of that by relying purely on where companies choose to invest. So, in an Indian context, we've had visits from various Indian states that are not one of those top five, and it's I think it's a harder sell. If you're a Silicon Valley company, you're going to India, and you can kind of see the infrastructure available in certain places, the supportive government policies, the relatively educated and available workforce. And then there's so much of India that is different, maybe less expensive, maybe a little bit less intense competition for talent, but I'm not sure how India solves that one, short of kind of the broad-based effort of digitalization now, which in principle should be able to expand, education and services and access across the country. Obviously, infrastructure plays a big factor, and it looks like India has been making progress on the infrastructure front, but a long way to go. And then that education front. I'm just looking at the U.S. experience. I think finding targeted ways to kind of stimulate maybe sector-based or other innovation activity through technology hubs in places where they don't exist. Can you accelerate the creation of an ecosystem? But I think a lot goes back in the end to education and basic education, infrastructure, and then the combination of that with the right kind of government policies that really incentivize private investment.
Mm-hmm. And it makes a lot of sense. But just going ahead on that, you did talk about Digital India, and you did touch upon many interesting facets like Aadhaar, the Jan Trinity idea, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar mobile, and the huge rise of people who are actually going onto the internet. But you made a very important point, and that was that these digital platforms are allowing startups and other companies to build on them. Any examples that you think are fascinating and from which or who the West can also learn in terms of what kind of models could actually be created?
Well, I'm not so good at rattling off names of companies. I've looked at lists of the fastest growing startup companies in India, and how many of them are digital, and it looks like a substantial majority are involved in different kinds of digital services, which are almost assuredly running on top of those platforms. So, we're seeing like digital health, digital education, certainly a lot around fintech, sort of extending services into those communities that may not have had access to them before. And so as digital literacy rises, I think the scale of that market grows. But I think certainly on the startup side, we're seeing many of the fastest growing companies that are either early stage or now growth companies in that e-commerce, digital health, digital insurance, digital education kind of space.
So, like Sean, this is perfect, and in terms of like what you're suggesting, but just a curious question here. Like when you talk about enterprises like within the education space and what India saw in the last 3 years, like there was this huge spike that possibly happened at the time of COVID when the digital education thing happened. Like everybody was starting to run to schools in terms of saying that, oh, we will provide for what I call digital literacy, numeracy. We'll take all sets of education there. But there were challenges that we actually did see. And now we are seeing that these set of enterprises are faltering as well. And the challenge was in terms of that, oh, you are not able to teach basic language skills or basic mathematics skills through the internet to the kids. Even on the higher education space, like what we are seeing is that there is a certain faltering of a certain set of companies. In fact, one of the biggest ones which seems to be faltering is Byju's, which was a blue-eyed enterprise until about 6 months back. What do you think? Like, what is the reason for failure of that kind of an enterprise? Because that can also create a lot of shrillness within the system as to how people look at the possibilities. From my point of view, I think it was very clear that digital education was not there to really become that big. It just skyrocketed because of COVID. It was just a very unique situation that had arisen at that point in time. But sustainability issues always existed.
Well, I think you're right, Amit. We've had that same experience in the United States too. During COVID, so much shifted very suddenly toward digital, and the trend was that way already, but it was just rocket fired because that's the way it had to work. And as you know, education, whether it was higher education or elementary education, was online, and so much of this activity was digital. And I think one of the lessons from that era was there was massive investment by companies here in Silicon Valley and elsewhere in expanding their workforces, because the assumption was that this was going to go on indefinitely. This was a permanent lock, and that was the future of the world. And then you get to 2022 and inflation rises and the Federal Reserve raises interest rates, and some companies start cutting back on their expenditures on digital things. And then all of a sudden, it's not that digitalization has stopped, but this is not an indefinite, permanent, long-term run where everything's going to be digital. And companies in the Valley start cutting back their employment because they overhired, because they overestimated the rate and the permanency of all this change that happened during the pandemic around digitalization. And I think a lot of companies they were necessarily virtual, but then they said, we're going to be forever virtual. Now they're figuring, really, we kind of do have to have our workforces back. So it feels like, if you look at it from the US experience, we experienced also a necessary and massive digitalization, and then realized in the last year or so, year to 2 years, that actually everything is not going to be digital. And there's going to be some kind of hybrid combination, which is how we're going to live. And so the digital doesn't drop off, but it doesn't define everything. And so education, we've learned this already. The data now is showing that actually the learning among students, say K through 12 in the US, really declined pretty badly. Performance on tests and other things. And that was really because they were not physically together. It was online. And it was the only way to do it for a while, but it didn't work as well. And so it wouldn't be surprising to see something similar happening in India, that it feels like we can't rely on just everything to be digital and that's going to be fine and that does the job, and it doesn't require investments in other things. So you've got, say in India, the quality of teachers at every level. You can have digital access, but if the quality of the teachers isn't there, then what are you teaching? So I think it requires investment at multiple levels, and the digital process, it's a fantastic platform and an enabler, but just saying we have digital access doesn't necessarily solve things.
Absolutely. And I know, like, the time's getting over, we just are left with about 3 to 4 minutes, but I still have one more question, and which is, from my point of view, I would like to learn is in terms of India is fascinated by the Silicon Valley, and you've been somebody who's been working in that area for ages. And the fascination is that, can India replicate the Silicon Valley model? And that's possibly the fascination across the world. I think it requires a lot for a replication to happen, but what is it that India can learn from Silicon Valley? How they can actually imbibe a certain set of policies moving forward? Because there is a lot to learn. Replication might not be possible, but there is a lot to learn.
It's an interesting question, Amit, because it comes up in a lot of contexts. A lot of countries say, how can we replicate Silicon Valley? And I think in the end, it is really hard for anybody to replicate it, whether in China or India or anywhere else for a variety of reasons. There's the and it's not policy reason. There's no blueprint that any government or anybody had. Oh, this is how we're going to go about this. But there have been investments, of course, that have been helpful. But in the Valley here, we have this really rich base of research universities, like 4 University of California campuses and Stanford. We've got almost 20% of the national research laboratories in the United States are here, like this wealth of independent nonprofit research laboratories, but across multiple disciplines. You've got tech, you've got everything in biotech, life science, nanotechnology, clean tech, you name it. You've got the space sector. And so the interaction of the multiple disciplines, and then with the technology and the founders, and then there's a high propensity of our universities in the Valley to produce founders. That's this remarkable base. And then you drop in the venture capital, which at any one year, between 1/3 and 45% of the venture investment in the US is taking place within the Bay Area. So the scale of the venture capital, which is especially growth capital, you can find early stage capital around the world more and more, which is great, but it's harder still to find the growth capital. And then you have this sort of global presence, the interactive presence of so many companies from around the world that are here together. And then you have this sort of governing philosophy of open innovation, accepting risk, accepting failure, and kind of innovating rapidly. So there's a critical mass that's hard to reproduce quickly, but at the end of the day, I think a lot of it goes back to the educational system, the higher education system, the entrepreneurial outlook and capacity of universities to support and generate founders who originate, whether they're faculty or students, on the campuses. It's the attitude among investors toward investing in risky propositions and startups and growth companies. You find a good amount of venture investment in Europe, but a lot of it's pretty conservative. They're bankers. And so, are you investing in really cutting edge kinds of things? I think part of it is, what are you investing in? What's the mix of things? And we go back and forth in the Valley on this, of things that are quick payout, maybe high reward, like social media, versus like hard tech, but the foundation is really, at the end of the day, hard tech. So how are you supporting kind of both kinds of things? And then developing companies that are themselves innovative domestically. So I think we've seen a lot of evolution in India's IT companies, making them more than just sort of outsource services and more in this sort of co-innovation space. But I think India still has a way to go in producing these kind of truly innovative leading edge companies at a world-class level. And again, I think you've got the role of the university and kind of the entrepreneurial outlook, the business outlook, and kind of combining all those things together with the infrastructure. So I think India can do a lot. India is already on the ground, but it's really hard to replicate Silicon Valley. But India is maybe Silicon Valley's most important global partner. And I think that's likely to grow, and probably the interaction of the two can be supportive of innovative development on both sides.
And one last question. If you have to tell 3 things that Indian policymakers should be doing, what are those top 3 things that they should do?
Well, this gets into like maybe policy perspectives, policy differences. I think in some ways, India is still kind of a protected market. So the more open India can be to FDI, the more open its markets can be, the better. For example, take Tesla. India, the government says to Tesla, "Hey, produce in India," and then Tesla says, "Well, that's great, but you have these massive tariffs on imports of Tesla cars." And by the way, we're not going to invest in India until we know there's a market in India. Well, maybe there is a market in India, but the Chinese, they don't have these, the Chinese of all people, Tesla can sell freely in China, but not in India. So I think there are still regulatory barriers, despite all the progress that India's made over the years, that still protect some Indian markets, where India would benefit from the competition and from the investment. So I think there's it's been moving in a good direction, but I think there's still quite a lot work to be done in that area.
Thank you, Sean. This has just been a very, very interesting interaction. I learned so much, and I hope every policymaker looks at this interaction, because for me, every word was a gem in terms of understanding as to what India is, what India can learn, what India needs to do. So thanks a lot for your time. I would like to thank everybody for joining the India Dialogue conversation today. It was just, and of course, we will continue with this interaction. Apologies that Richard was not able to join. He was in a very tough time zone today. He was in Japan, so he was just not able to join. So apologies on his behalf that he was not able to be here. But we do meet next month as well with much more interesting conversation. And of course, I would like to say two more things, like please put it on your calendars. The next India Dialogue Summit happens on 29th Feb, 1st of March, and we're looking at a very exciting program. And if you are excited to meet Sean, you should be there, because I'm sure he's going to be there at that summit as well. And before I break, I should wish everybody a happy Diwali. And it is just happening in a couple of weeks. Enjoy the Festival of Lights and be well and be safe. Thank you. And thanks a lot, Sean, for joining us today. It was just a real honor and a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ahmed. It's been a pleasure, and I'll look forward to the summit.
Thank you.
And Diwali.
Bye-bye. See you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.